Alright guys, we're going to be talking about CSS3 today. This is going to be pretty brief. Most of the things in CSS3 are things that we already talked about when we just introduced CSS. A couple of things that are new that I'm going to focus on, but a lot of this is going to be review. And most of it will probably be stuff that you're already familiar with. So here you can see a bullet list of what W3 Schools is pointing out are kind of the most important modules, as they call them, important new modules in CSS3. And as we go through these, you're going to see that we really talked about a lot of them already. So let's just start. Borders is one of the things that we clearly talked about already. If you open up the code example here, you'll notice these properties on the div, like border radius. This is something that we've done already in a couple of the past assignments, so that's nothing new. But border radius is technically part of CSS3. This leads to an interesting thing, though, that we need to be cognizant of going forward, which is browser support. So with every one of these features we're talking about, and to be clear, the features are just properties of CSS. So, for example, the border radius property. You can see here that the border radius property is only supported in IE 9+. So if you're running Internet Explorer 6 or 7 or 8, the border radius property in CSS is not going to work. These things are pretty important if you are running a business, when you have a really lot of customers hitting your site. For example, I work at Progressive. This might be okay, border radius might be okay, because Internet Explorer 9 is I guess kind of old at this point. But if, for example, if this said it didn't, wasn't supported at all in Internet Explorer, then we probably wouldn't be able to make that a viable option. So for all of these things that we're going through in CSS3, keep in mind which browsers have support for it. Internet Explorer, Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and Opera. So you want to keep those in mind while we're going through all of these. So these borders are really nothing new. We've done those before. Backgrounds, same thing. We've used the background size, background repeat. We've used all these properties before. So this kind of a style here and this kind of an effect over here should not be a big surprise to us. Those are pretty old news. So that was pretty much part of our introduction to CSS. Gradients, again, that was also part of our introduction to CSS, but I just want to point out that the way we did those in the past was we used a gradient generator. So if I said CSS gradient generator, click on the first one, Ultimate CSS Gradient Generator. You pretty much always use a gradient generator to make these things for you. So I'll pick a pattern, I'll pick a color over here. It doesn't have to be pretty, it's just for example. And then when I copy it using the link copy and paste that in a notepad, I'll have my gradient. You'll notice the gradient consists of a background property over and over and over. The reason it's doing it multiple times is because we need different instructions for different types of browsers. So it says here in the comments, this is for IE10+, this is for Opera, this is for Chrome. It seems kind of crappy that we have to put in different CSS styles for different browsers, but we do. So, generally for gradients, what we do is we go into some type of gradient generator and we just copy and paste that, and then we'll paste it into our style, which will go something like right here. So we'll pick something on the screen, we'll select it, and then we'll just paste in our gradient. So we've done that before. I just wanted to highlight the fact that we usually at least get most of the CSS code from a generator, and then you can tweak it from there. And also, again, this is a good example of this stuff is different for different browsers, and we've seen that before. I just wanted to talk about it once again. It's gradients. Text effects we've seen before. I'm not sure if we used text shadow in particular, but you can see here the text shadow. If you ever need to know about the particular properties, you should be able to. I'm not sure how to get there from here, but I usually just go to Google, say CSS text shadow parameters. It should show W3 Schools link right here. So H shadow, V shadow, and blur. So the horizontal shadow, vertical shadow, and blur. So that's the API there. So 5 pixels of horizontal, 5 pixels of vertical, 5 pixels of blur, and that looks like a pure red. And then we get the text shadow effect. And this particular property is supported in IE10. So IE9 doesn't support text shadow. So this one's a little even more exclusive. So very important to pay attention to browser support. So all this stuff, oh, word wrap too. We've done this before. So to keep the word inside of a certain region, we can specify break word. And obviously you need a width so that it knows when to break. So I think we've used that in the past, and it's pretty straightforward. The first CSS3 feature that is really new and that we haven't talked about and that I do want to go into detail for is font face. So font face is actually an instruction in CSS which is more complicated than marking up the client side with a style. So first note the browser support, IE9 and past. And I want to describe how this works. So we start with this instruction font face, and one of the properties is source with a URL to a file. This is important because this implies that we're going to have to make a callback to the web server. So as soon as the client reads this, it literally needs to make another call to the server asking for this file at that particular URL. The reason we would want to do this is because sometimes we want to use a font that does not exist on the client's computer. If you want to use Verdana, everybody's going to have that. If you want to use Arial, everybody's going to have that. But if you want to use a different type of font that the person is probably not going to have, then you're going to use this font face feature that CSS3 provides. In the past, we had to use Flash or some other type of technology if we wanted to transport a font to somebody else's computer that we could use. But in this case, now pure plain old CSS HTML, we can say, hey, send this font to the person's computer. It's my it's my special font that maybe I created myself, but I want to transport it to their computer so that they can see it in the special font that I created. So that actually forces the font file to get sent over to their client, and it names the font so that you can use it just like a normal font. So you can see in this div, once we've executed the font face directive, we can kind of say, oh, now I want my font for this particular div to be that font that I declared. So it's kind of like a variable declaration, and this is where we say, hey, now I want to use that font. The example down here is just exemplifying that if you have a bold version of the font, that's actually a separate font, because a font is a bunch of glyphs or images, each one of them depicting each letter, and a bold glyph is completely different than a normal glyph. So two different fonts, one for regular and one for bold. So it's not that complicated, but I think font face is important because it's a feature that's clearly new in CSS3. It's not just a property, it's a little bit different. It's this directive that you have to set up before you're able to use the property. So and it's something that's very cool and useful because most nice rich designs use customized fonts. So chances are you're going to use font face, and it's nice to know that it's part of CSS3 and that it's there, and you can embed fonts, custom fonts, and it's pretty well supported, as you can see here. Only really old browsers don't support font face. Okay, so getting on to the transforms. Before we talk about transforms and animations, actually I'll save it at the end. What I want to do is I want to talk about the difference between jQuery and CSS for doing transforms and animations and when to use which. So let me remind myself to do that. So I'll just talk about this really quick. So a transform in general in graphics is moving something or changing its size or its position. And so the general transforms are a translate. A translate would be a movement on an axis. A scale would be making it bigger or smaller, and then a rotation would be, obviously rotating something on its x or y axis, or on one of its axes. So, for all of these transforms, no matter what they are, you're going to see multiple commands depending on what browser it is. So, MS transform for Internet Explorer, big surprise, Microsoft transform, WebKit transform for Chrome, Safari, and Opera, and just normal transform for everything else. So it is going to be a pain. There's not going to be one universal property for everything, and that sucks, but that's the way it is right now. That's going to be part of my argument for maybe doing some of this stuff in jQuery if possible. But this is basically how you do it. So a simple translate, if it were only this, it would look simple. So translate 50x and 100y. So that would take a div, and by saying go to this x coordinate, this y coordinate, big surprise, it moves it to the right and down. So it's very simple, but you need to specify 3 different forms of that instruction because of the browser differences. So that makes it a pain. Other than that, it's a simple selector of a piece on the screen and telling it to move. So that's a transform, the most basic translation. A rotate is the same thing, except instead of translate, it says rotate and gives it amount of degrees, and you can see it spins it, rotates it on its axis. Also very simple. Scale, again, same thing, very simple. You're giving it a 2 scale would mean double the size, so it's doubling the width and multiplying the height times 4. Again, very simple, but also 3 different instructions for 3 different browser sets. So the reason I'm talking about transforms so fast is because, well, let me finish first. I'll say it in a second. 3D transformations are spinning something on an x or y axis. So imagine a piece of paper in a 3D environment, holding up in front of your face and then spinning it on its axis in a 3D environment. And that will help you visualize, what it would look like. And you can kind of see that, if you take this plain old piece of paper and spin it on its x-axis, it looks like it's turning. So that's kind of a 3D effect. And it's rotate x. So again, simple instructions, no different than before. These are all very easy features that come with CSS3. Transitions are pretty much the same thing, except they're a little more complicated to set up. So with the transition, you have to first set up a transition property and say which property that you're going to transition and how long the duration is going to last for. So this would say, I'm going to transition the width for a period of 2 seconds. And then down here, we set up a hover state so that we define a width and say, hey, when the mouse is hovering over you, now all of a sudden you're in a different state and your width should be 300. So it's easier to see in this example here, because you have 2 states. You have the normal state of the div, where the width is 100. That's the state we're seeing over here right now with the red square being 100 pixels wide. And this is saying, hey, when you're in the hover state, so when the mouse is over you, your state is going to change to be 300 pixels wide. So that's where this transition property is going to say, hey, when I change states for my width, I want it to kind of animate over this transition of 2 seconds. So it's not going to just flip the width from 100 pixels to 300 pixels like we would see with a media query. The transition allows us to specify a duration so that it can look like a smooth animation. So when I hover over it, it takes 2 seconds to reach its new width. And this should look very similar to some of the things we did in jQuery. So I'm almost to the point where I tell you that I prefer jQuery for animations. Almost there. Last one, I'm going to scroll down to this big example here. So notice this square. It's moving and it's changing color. So what did we have to do to this? We did something very similar to this in jQuery. We were moving stuff around and changing its color. Let's look at that one more time. So we did that in jQuery with a couple of lines of code. So what's going on over here is that we're giving it a list of states, its color, its XY coordinate, and how long during the transition to do that for. So we have a total transition of 5 seconds. So for the first 25% of that 5 seconds, it's going to transition from 0, 0 to 200, 0, which is a horizontal movement. So we can clearly read that it's going to move through these states, and it's kind of like laying out a path. And you can do this, but again, I'm going to note that you have to give the instructions twice, one for a standard syntax, one for Chrome, Safari, and Opera. So, oh, by the way, note this example does not work in Internet Explorer 9 and earlier. So that's, again, another thing to think about. All in all, I just want to point out that all of these animations, you have to basically choose whether you want to do them in jQuery or CSS. And I guess philosophically you should ask yourself, is this behavior or is this style? And me personally, I feel like this is behavior, and I tend to code this kind of thing in jQuery. I think it's easier in jQuery, and I think it belongs in jQuery. That's just my opinion. But you still should be able to read this type of CSS code, understand what it's doing, and be able to modify it, even if it's your personal inclination to develop things in jQuery, which I think it should be. But even if that's the case, you should be able to understand the features that CSS provides and the ability to read through this type of code and use it. So the reason I'm going through these things so fast is because I really don't believe you should ever use them. I really never, not only do I never, but I don't know anybody who does client-side animation in CSS. There are some things, if you find something, I'm sure there's a couple of features that are provided in CSS that are not provided in jQuery. I'm not really sure offhand what they are, but if you come across things like that, of course, it's okay to do something in CSS. But I can't really think of anything off the top of my head that jQuery doesn't do better. I'm not like the world's total expert on these things, but off the top of my head, I've never really faced an animation situation where jQuery wasn't just totally better and easier. So that's the end of my little spiel about that. CSS multiple columns. This is another thing that I kind of really don't believe should ever be used. I mean, take a look at this. So what it's, well, I think the previous one is the same thing without the pink bars. Yeah. So what this is doing is it's setting up a property called column count and a property called column gap. And again, for each of those properties, you have to specify it 3 times for different browser sets. So I don't feel very comfortable with this. Not as comfortable as I would with laying out 3 divs and giving them each a style of display inline block. Handling the layout as simply as possible in CSS and not having to rely on column count and column gap. These are certainly more sophisticated. I just feel like the more minimalistic approach works a little bit better in this case. I mean, we've done things like this with 3 columns that are side by side before. We just never used this particular CSS feature. If you feel that this makes your life easier, feel free to use it. I personally never use these 2 features. And let's see what kind of support we have. Pretty decent support. IE9 doesn't support it, so actually it's not that great. And then coming down to the last set of stuff here, this is actually a feature that I love. Resize is a great property in CSS3. It gives you the ability to grab something and make it bigger and smaller right in the middle of the screen. I totally love that. I really do. There's only one small problem. Not supported in Internet Explorer at all. Internet Explorer doesn't support it. And if you're working at a big company where market penetration matters, this is a showstopper. That is a game ender right there. Not supported in Internet Explorer means cannot use. So I would never be able to use this at Progressive because we have millions of customers, and we can't, let millions of people not be able to use a feature of our application. So that's why it's important to be aware of the browser support for the feature that you're talking about. And I think that kind of illustrates at least a pretty good set of things that CSS3 brings to the table. Nobody's ever going to be completely familiar with all the specifications of CSS3. I suppose you could buy a book and just read through the entire thing, but for the most part, I usually let the requirements dictate what I need to do, instead of like going out there and reading all the possible things that are available in the language. Figure out what the requirements are, what you need to do, and search the API or just Google what types of tools are available in the specification to meet those requirements. So that's kind of my spiel about CSS3. Probably the biggest win I thought in CSS3 was the custom fonts, the font face, so that you could transport custom fonts to people that didn't have that font. All this other stuff, I guess I never even realized was part of CSS3. One day somebody told me, hey, did you know that those borders and the backgrounds you're using are not supported in this or that browser? But this was kind of like the in-your-face, for me, good, really awesome new feature of CSS3. I don't really use any of these animations or user interface things because I try to always do visual behavior and animations in jQuery. But I'm totally open to people telling me, showing me the error of my ways. Please feel free to weigh in on the discussion boards if you think that CSS3 is great or way better than jQuery, or does something that jQuery can't even do. So I'd love to hear about that stuff too. So at this point, I think we'll just stop, and I'm deadly sure that there's some people in the class that know more than me about CSS3. I'm in no way, shape, or form a CSS3 expert, so please feel free to teach me and the rest of the class cool things that you can do, and hopefully we'll all learn a lot from it.